My name is Christina Madzewska, and for my action research plan, I will be exploring the question, how can I embed numeracy in my English lessons to improve students' ability to recognize and use patterns and relationships in narrative text? According to Barwell, numeracy is necessary to one's positive interpretations and interactions with the world. Numeracy does not necessarily always involve the use of numbers, diagrams, calculation, and mathematical methods, but it does include some degree of abstract thought and attention to structure, which is also seen in literacy. Barton and Hamilton describe activities such as gardening, cooking, repairing, shopping, traveling, paying bills, and so on, as everyday activities that include a degree of numeracy within them. Therefore, to produce numerate individuals who are capable of positively interacting with the world by using their good numeracy abilities, it is necessary to ensure that these same numeracy skills are introduced at the beginning of one's education journey. According to the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, to become numerate, students will need to gain mathematical skills, behaviours, and dispositions that they are able to apply in a variety of situations and everyday tasks. The ACARA have established 6 key elements of numeracy as a general capability, which are designed to be incorporated in all disciplines within the curriculum. I will investigate a strategy developed by Geiger for teaching numeracy in English through a technique as simple as clarifying lesson expectation and making explicit links to the practice of numeracy. I will be visually organising the noticeable patterns and relationships seen within a narrative into graphic organisers with my students. I will also be experimenting with these graphic organisers pre, during, and post-reading activities, however in collaboration with group work in order to aid comprehension of the narrative information. And finally, I will explore the technique of graphing in collaboration with teacher-led class discussion. I will be doing this with Year 9 English students in order to provide my students with opportunities to develop their numeracy knowledge in relation to real-world situations and make accurate predictions and generalizations about real-life events based on the patterns and relationships that we discuss in class. I'm going to do this through the 4 steps of action research, which are plan, act, observe, and reflect. To improve my practice when it comes to embedding numeracy in my teaching, I will look at numeracy in 1 unit of study in English, which goes on for 5 to 6 weeks. And the topic of study is focused around the examining literature substrand in the Victorian curriculum. And this presentation is a research proposal for 1 action research cycle for me as a classroom practitioner to improve my practice. I want to employ this practice in order to improve the quality of teaching and learning within my classroom. This type of action research will help me to better analyse student understanding of the topic at hand and improve my own teaching through a collection of data and reflection on my own practice. Little research has taken place with regards to specific teaching strategies that education practitioners can employ to teach patterns and relationships in an English classroom. Some studies have found that techniques such as group work, when paired with other learning activities, are most beneficial to learning for numeracy. For example, Manoli and Papadopoulou explore different types of graphic organisers that can be used in the classroom in order to demonstrate clear visual links between relationships and recurring patterns in a narrative. However, they almost always discuss the use of graphic organisers in collaboration with an additional learning activity such as discussion or debate. Similarly, Stott's study on teaching patterns in narrative combines graphing the frequency of a repeated word in a novel with explicit teacher explanation on the significance of the repeated words as an effective way to employ numeracy techniques in an English classroom. Finally, explicit instruction on why these numeracy skills are important within the context of narrative, but also real life broadly, is also an important strategy covered by Geiger. That is, explicitly linking the ability to detect patterns and relationships in a novel to the ability to then make accurate predictions and generalizations about life based on observed patterns is a way to make numeracy learning more relevant. This topic is important to my practice as I can incorporate and adjust these teaching techniques to suit my classroom of Year 9 English students in order to develop their abilities to detect and apply patterns and relationships. Considering numeracy is a general capability according to the ACARA, I need to ensure that I'm meeting the APSTs and practicing literacy and numeracy strategies in my classroom to enhance students' confidence in their mathematical abilities. It is my responsibility as a teacher to find the numeracy moments within the English curriculum to ensure that I'm constantly adding to the skills that students will need to tackle 21st century living effectively. Numeracy abilities are vital for effective social, political, economical, and environmental interactions, and so long as I continuously expose my students to these numeracy moments in my English classroom, I feel that I will be doing my duty as a teacher by setting and maintaining high standards of competence in my students. The aims of my initiative are to improve students' abilities to recognize and use patterns and relationships within a narrative. They will be able to make explicit links on the patterns and the relationships that they have found through visual means such as graphic organizers. They will be able to then discuss and explain how these patterns and relationships may have an effect on the overall narrative. And more broadly, they will be able to make an explicit link between between how their abilities to detect these patterns and relationships in a novel can then translate to their abilities to make judgments in real life. They will be able to link these patterns and relationships to other content or narratives covered in English texts, or even other texts that they have studied in other disciplines. Very broadly, these are the 4 strategies that I will be employing within my English classroom. However, I will go into detail within the next few slides on each strategy specifically. For this unit of work, I will be using Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone as the main narrative, just for reference, and this very first strategy is based on Geiger's findings on explicit teaching. So for my first teaching and learning activity, I will be giving an explanation as to why patterns and relationships are important to Harry Potter. For example, there are multiple themes in the Harry Potter novel, including death. It's a recurring theme, which could be an indication as to the end result of the novel, and perhaps a lot of the recurrence that takes place exists to foreshadow what is to come. So this activity is to ensure that my students are well aware of the links to repetition and pattern in the narrative, which is the skill of the numerate, and better prepare them to make accurate predictions about what they believe will happen. The second activity is glossary, where students will come up with a working definition of the words pattern, relationships, repetition, connection, links, and so on as a class, and then each individual student can look up the definitions to the words online or in a dictionary and refine these definitions to these words. They can then engage in a think, pair, share, where they turn to the person next to them and explain their definition and give a suggestion on how the other student can improve theirs, and so on. So this is very similar to what the teacher did in Geiger's study, who also defined the key numeracy related words on the board. The way I will assess my impact is through audio recording of the entire lesson, where I'm giving the explicit description of the meaning of patterns and relationships. And if my explanations were clear enough, the students should be able to produce a clear working definition of pattern and relationship as a result. Then later, their definitions should be even more refined and even easier to understand. I will also be able to go back through the audio and listen to the students' definition of the words and see if they have understood how numeracy is actually involved in this narrative. Strategy 2 involves a very explicit link to mathematical skills, which is graphing patterns seen in a narrative. So this is based off Stott's findings in 1982. The first activity will be highlighting repeated keywords. Prior to the reading of the narrative, I will instruct my students to highlight in blue, for example, the amount of times that Harry Potter is mentioned, versus in orange, how many times Ronald Weasley is mentioned, and so on. So this type of activity can continue on throughout the entire novel, and I can instruct my students to label when 2 characters appear in the same scene, when these 2 characters argue or make up, and so on. This could also lead to debate activities based around the question of, is Harry Potter really the protagonist of the Harry Potter series, or is the book based on another character? And the students can use these graphs to emphasize this debate. Graphing is the added activity to this, where I will instruct my students to go to a particular chapter in the novel and plot the highlighted words on the graph. So I may have had to create a model graph to guide the students on how to go about creating their own, and this is a very explicit way to get the students to use these mathematical skills in order to visualize exactly how patterns are used in narrative writing such as Harry Potter. So the way I will assess my impact is by conducting a verbal questionnaire and recording this audibly, and the types of questions that I could ask my students in regards to this strategy could be, could you see particular patterns forming in regards to specific characters or scenes or themes or settings? Was this activity engaging? Or how did you feel about your own abilities to detect patterns prior to this? Could you come to your own conclusion as to what the repetition of certain events or characters may mean to the overall narrative? Following this, I could journal my own thoughts on how well I think to address these questions in my teaching. Could I have done a better job and maybe made my teaching even more explicit? Strategy 3 involves using graphic organizers to sort patterns and relationships. For my pedagogy, I will conduct an explicit instruction on the types of graphic organizers that exist. So using Manoli and Papadopoulou's description of the different types of graphic organizers, I will explain the purpose of each of them and when a particular graphic organizer may be used. So the types of graphic organizers that I could include in this class include Venn diagrams, concept maps, compare and contrast charts, story maps, knowledge maps, tree diagrams, and so on. So then students will create their own graphic organizer. So individually, students will select the type of graphic organizer that they would like to create and then select from a list of relationships in the narrative that I will provide them with. For example, Hermione and Harry, Dumbledore, Hagrid, or even Hogwarts and Number 4 Privet Drive. Students must then pick a graphic organizer that focuses on highlighting the similarities and differences between these characters or settings in order to create greater comparisons on the relationships that exist in the novel and work on these numeracy skills of detecting these relationships. So for this one, I'll be recording my verbal questioning of the whole class once more, and the types of questions that I could ask include, did organizing the information into a Venn diagram help you better connect 2 characters together? Did you notice anything that you hadn't previously noticed simply by putting the information in a diagram? I will also collect samples of student work pre, during, and post reading. This technique was also used in Manoli and Papadopoulou's studies, where the researchers were able to see the development of the student understanding at all stages throughout the narrative. So this could add to my data. And finally, for strategy 4, I will pair the use of graphic organizers and graphs with group work and class discussion, as done in Milton, Rowland House. So for example, using the individual graphic organizers that the students have created, I will organize them into groups according to those who have done the same graphic organizers, or I can choose to arrange the students into groups who have completed different graphic organizers but maybe on the same relationships in the narrative. Students will exchange the ideas that they found in their graphic organizers and add to each other's graphic organizers using different colored pencils that have been assigned to each student in the class. This way I can track their progress. The class discussion following group work. The class discussion following the group work can be run by me as the teacher in order to gain an understanding of the students' findings, and then this will also be a way for me to assess my strategy and see if it has actually worked in the class. Once again, I will be recording the verbal questioning of the whole class, and the types of questions that I can ask include: did you find out any new information on the relationships within the novel that you hadn't previously explored? How did you find this activity? Did you detect more patterns throughout the chapter that you explored? And now onto the observe step of my action research. So the type of data that I will collect is qualitative, and it is aimed around student engagement and achievement based on the specific teaching strategies that I'm employing that lesson. Using the questions that I've carefully set out before the lessons, the data that I collect will hopefully help me to understand if my instructions were clear, and if the students were understanding the content, and if I was making the links to numeracy clear enough, and how I can improve my practice in the ensuing lessons. I'm trying to assess the effectiveness of my teaching, so therefore the data that I collect will have a practical significance to my future practices. Most of the data that I plan on collecting throughout the unit will be audio recordings, as this will be easier for me to incorporate into my daily practice. However, I will then create a transcript of the audio using a transcribing software such as this website, to ensure that I also have a written copy which will help me better recognize and organize certain patterns and themes within my practice, categorized and sorted into a format which I can easily analyze. For this, I will use the 5 stages of data analysis as outlined by Pope, Zeeblend and Mace, where I will familiarize myself with the data by continuously listening to the audio, reading over the transcripts and studying the notes that I have made in regards to my teaching practice over this unit of study. To analyze the data, I will ensure that I'm repeatedly engaging with it. I will identify the common thematic issues and concepts that come up by using visual organization techniques like highlighters, sticky notes and folders. Then I will group this information into manageable chunks that can be easily accessed. Some of these chunks of information could be categorized into labels like levels of student engagement within the lesson, or clarity of instructions, or level of student understanding. I will then index the grouped information with a short blurb on the common theme or the purpose of the data chunk. For example, in the levels of understanding category that I've labeled, I may want to describe it as student understanding of the directions following my explicit teacher instruction. This includes the amount of times that a question is repeated by a student and how long it takes for these students to begin working on their task, so on. I will then rearrange the data into different charts on each key theme or subject area, and this will allow me to see a summary of the different sub-themes that have come up within that data. These charts will analyze both thematic and content-driven data in order for me to notice the consistencies and commonalities between both. Finally, I will map and interpret the findings in order to come up with explanations for the results. So I will notice the common trends or deficits in the data, which I can attempt to fill throughout my practice. Of course, there is a dependent relationship between me as a researcher and the students as participants in my action research plan. Therefore, in my data collection of audio recordings of questioning and student work samples, I understand that students may not always respond with their honest answers or opinions. Therefore, some of the data may be limited in its reliability. In using verbal recordings, I will be complying with the codes of conduct of the school, as well as those outlined by the VIT and the Government of Education and Training, to ensure that I'm not doing any harm to the students. Rather, I will make sure that my data collection and analysis methods are explicitly stated to the students. I will de-identify students by removing any mentions of their names or any personal information from the audio recordings and student samples, to ensure that their privacy and confidential information is never at risk. And depending on the findings of my action research plan, I will continue employing the strategies that my students responded to positively, and I will attempt to better the techniques that did not work so well. This is the first cycle in my action research, so I will use this data to continue to improve my practice and aid my interpretations of the future data that I collect. I will focus on improving my work as a result of my findings, and even though I have researched and I am using methods conducted by other researchers, I am not seeking to contribute to the knowledge about detecting patterns and relationships broadly, but rather I am attempting to more explicitly incorporate learning for numeracy in my Year 9 English classroom settings. To reflect on this, I know that the purpose of this action research plan is to improve my teaching practice in developing students' abilities to detect patterns and relationships in narratives like Harry Potter. Ultimately, the aim is to positively impact students' numeracy abilities and expose them to the idea that numeracy is found in all disciplines, not just maths. This particular action plan will help students practice their ability to make accurate predictions, judgments, and decisions decisions about narrative in an English classroom, but also ultimately better their ability to rehearse these skills in real life. This initiative, along with its results and data, will hopefully inform me as a teacher on the practices and strategies that students in my class prefer. It will serve as a stepping stone to improve students' level of engagement in my class, as with each action research cycle, I will discover more trends in the data that will help improve my teaching habits. I will be able to tailor the teaching and learning activities to better suit the needs of my students and continue to enhance their numeracy abilities, not just in this element of numeracy, but in all 6 as outlined by the ACARA. At the completion of this action research cycle, I will begin the next, as action research, according to Mills, does not end with the analysis of data, but rather with continuous changes to practice to ensure that I'm constantly improving as an educator. Following the results of this cycle, I will employ the 4 steps of action research once more and try to employ a variation of these 4 teaching strategies in the next unit of work. Considering numeracy is a general capability that is necessary to functioning effectively in 21st century life, there is always room to research and improve my teaching practices relating to numeracy in my English classroom. The data that I collect and interpret will frame my future practices with this class and others. Data-driven decision-making, DDDM, is a key practice listed by Datno, Park and Kennedy Lewis, where teachers continuously practice making informed judgments in order to improve student achievement. That is, in order to effectively assess, provide feedback to, and report on student learning, which is an ATSL standard, I need to ensure that I'm constantly gaining and interpreting student data and adjusting my practices to improve the student engagement and abilities in my class. So while this type of action research can considerably improve my teaching practice, there is still a level of limitation around action research which cannot be avoided because of the subjectivity of this research. I am aware that I can never be completely impartial when researching myself as an educator, so there is a potential for misinterpretation of data. There is also a level of dependability where, although my students may have my best interests at heart when answering some of my questions, they might unintentionally skew my data. One more constraint is that among the other demands of teaching, action research may come second to the teaching itself, according to Whitford. While recording audio may be seamlessly integrated into the classroom, I then also have to dedicate my time to analysing and interpreting the data, while I'm also required to plan for future classes and continue on with all the other practices that come with being a teacher. So in turn, time restraints can become an issue. However, these issues are not to cloud the importance of action research in the development of my teaching practice. And I'm aware that action research is part of developing my teacher abilities. So to summarise, the ultimate aim of an action research plan such as this is to help me become a better teacher of numeracy. This initiative will allow me to practice my duty as an educator, where I'm constantly improving the levels of teaching and learning that are taking place in my classroom. To ensure that my students are constantly working at their zone of proximal development regardless of the topic, I need to ensure that I'm constantly tailoring the learning to best suit their needs. The types of data that I gain and interpret from this action research will help me support the student learning and engagement levels in my classroom so that they are always practicing their numeracy abilities and that they understand how numeracy is related to all disciplines and all aspects of life. Action research is necessary to the development of teaching practices. Pre-service teachers such as myself need to be able to constantly examine the aims, values, and learning that is taking place in my class. Pre-service teachers such as myself need to be able to constantly examine the aims, values, and learning that is taking place in their class and endeavour to always improve according to Liston and Zeichner. Action research is intended to encourage reflection on the teaching practice that is taking place and find a means to incorporate better techniques that will aid the students. It is my duty as an educator to develop my practice so that my students are constantly exposed to opportunities which will lead them to success. I will embed the results of this action research cycle, as well as all of the others that I conduct, in my teaching and become a teacher researcher that constantly develops their abilities as an educator. By having thoroughly researched the types of numeracy teaching strategies that exist in the literature and then attempting to employ these strategies through action research cycle in my classroom, I would have eliminated the practices that do not work for my classroom based on the data that I gathered. This type of research will then improve my teaching of numeracy, as it will allow me to analyze my skills as a teacher and ensure that I'm always using up-to-date and effective resources and strategies that will nurture and improve my students' numeracy abilities. Overall, considering numeracy is a necessary capability for modern learners, I will be doing my duty as an educator to ensure that I am producing students who are capable of functioning effectively and positively in 21st century life. Here comes the reference list for all of the references that I've incorporated throughout my research plan, and thank you very much for listening.